Okay, continuing on with the 100 books that I read in 2021. Hopefully splitting this video off into two parts will encourage people a little bit more to, and if you don't want to watch the whole thing, that's fine. It's just me kind of inventory, basically, just kind of, I try to offer little opinions here and there, but anyway, but I left off, I believe, in April, where I read... I did March, right? Yeah, okay, so March is done. Okay, yes. So April, and first thing I read was Nausea by Jean-Paul Sartre. I did a review, I think. Number 2, Parallel Lives by Plutarch. Roman, I believe, poet, I think. Parallel Lives had, I think, was like 100, maybe 200 AD, and I think he was around the time of Ovid as well. I don't know too much. I'm actually really rusty on, like, Hellenic / Greco-Roman history. It's all, like, I'll go on a binge of, like, I'll watch, like, a few documentaries, like, but all that was, like, years ago, so it's, like, really kind of grasping at straws. If you ask me, like, what Plutarch was all about, all I know is that he was a poet, and then he talked about parallel lives and how lives of, like, these different deities, and I think they're mainly, like, Greco deities, so, and how they kind of relate to one another. Like, it might be that, or, like, the warriors, too, like, kind of, like, of the Aeneid, and, you know, all these kind of, a lot of heroes were kind of classical, kind of, you know, seize the day kind of types. But anyway, so after that was Arabian Nights, 1001 Nights. Obviously, we don't know the true author. I mean, there was one... I think her name was something Shahrazad. I'm totally butchering that name, but yeah, she was like one of the few authors that were kind of like identifiable, and we're not sure how much she wrote of it, but I do know that there's a bunch of it's oral tradition from Saudi Arabia, like, so it was all passed down through. So it's really hard to kind of ascertain these kinds of things. So, but yeah, I enjoyed it. It was like I heard people before it had been, you know, that's like a book a lot of people grow up with too. I think, you know, in various iterations we get, you know, be it like through Aladdin or, you know, something as accessible, as digestible as that, to something more, but I think, you know, the translation was pretty good. The Lost Writings of Franz Kafka. Yeah, there's a few of those books I have that are just short stories and are just kind of my attempt at trying to piece together everything that Kafka wrote. But it's kind of hard because some of these books you will read multiple times. Like I'll get like a thing and then I'll have the same story, like with the exception being like The Burrow, which I actually didn't read till recently, but some of them are actually freely online. You could go online, franzkafka.com. I think it's just called Kafka Online. And you can just, you know, I'm not advertising the site, I'm not getting money, but yeah, you can definitely go on that site, and there's tons of different, not all of his available stuff, obviously. You know, you're not going to be able to read The Castle, I don't think, but you're definitely able to read, maybe not any of his novels, but all his short stories, and like his, that, and like, you know, the very kind of concise tales, kind of proverbs, almost like, modern day flash fiction with like Poseidon's, like a really easy to read 1 or 2 page thing. So yeah, that's just me trying to slowly work through Kafka. And we have The Call of Cthulhu, H.P. Lovecraft. Obviously I heard of him before. I just hadn't read him. I'd had the copy of that on my bookshelf for quite some time, and I never quite got around to it because I was kind of intimidated by Lovecraft. I thought there was like something I was missing that I didn't quite understand about him, but yeah, there's definitely the imagination, like, lives on. It's like, you know, the horror, and I think from hearing about TEDx, I think actually had a really interesting take on him, although I'm not like a huge fan of like the TED Talk kind of format, but, you know, obviously TEDx is completely, they have like animations and stuff. It's not like just them blabbering, some random guy blabbering on a stage for kind of pseudo science thing or whatever. But yeah, there's I think the thing with Lovecraft is that he was trying to create. It was really hard to scare people after what they saw after both World Wars, and just the horrors that they brought of just like, you know, mass murder, mass genocide, just everything. A whole lot of that was kind of already kind of tipped everybody off, but just kind of made them numb in a sense. Like everybody's just kind of like numb to that. So he had to kind of use his imagination to kind of think of new things that were, you know, new creatures, new different universes too. You know, like Innsmouth and Cthulhu and you know, the Necronomicon, which I've yet to read because again, that's another thing. Like I don't know why Philip K. Dick, but his what's it, the something or other, the heuristic, I think what was it, the something, according to Philip K. Dick, I think the exotic exegesis, yes, it was Jonathan Lethem, I think, did that, and it was like kind of him piecing his stuff together, but I haven't read it yet just because of the length, and it's just like I want to see if I can get through more of Philip K. Dick stuff, just like want to get through more Cormac McCartney stuff. So yeah, that's the same thing with Lovecraft Necronomicon is that it's a something that's just so vast, and I'm not sure if I'm ready for it yet, but I say as I take on these other tomes. So yeah, after that was Glassbead Game by Hermann Hesse, definitely one of my favorites of all time of Hermann Hesse. I did review it on this channel. I do remember that. There was a lot of Jungian psychology in that too, like just individuation, you know, with Joseph Nietzsche, you know, going through from a young man in what was it, Castalia, to, you know, going through living out the different lives and the different kind of iterations of, you know, the not the collective unconscious, but the different iterations of like the cognitive functions of like sensation and, you know, intuition and feeling, thinking, like he's, you know, throughout, like whether it's the Rainmaker kind of going out and swashbuckler kind of traveler, he's, you know, very intrepid and kind of willing to do anything, just open to all these, you know, new experiences, or whether it's the isolated monk type person. You see this kind of also in his Narcissus and Goldmund too, like the different kind of psychology between the two of Narcissus, obviously, and Goldmund, of how they contrast, but they also complement each other. It's not like all about a game of like, you know, Narcissus owning Goldmund with facts and, you know, knowledge, and it's like, no, it's, you know, Goldmund's totally capable of doing things, and the finesse of his hands and like the way he's able to create such, you know, beautiful work when he puts his mind into it, but like without that kind of guidance, you know, either, i.e. Narcissus, that kind of like mature wisdom, he's kind of aimless and, you know, wandering kind of, you know, he's not, you know, and he's not meant for the cloister. I did that too, so I don't know why I'm reviewing it, but I just want to point out the similarities there. Yeah, Alice in Wonderland with Lewis Carroll. I never actually read that. Obviously, I remember seeing the movie quite some time ago as a kid, and just being kind of dazzled by the, you know, the world building, the imagination, the vivid kind of scenery of, you know, of not just, you know, 1800s, you know, mid 1800s England, but also just like these great kind of labyrinth, almost like, you know, very, you know, questioning logic, very logic, a lot of spinning logic on its head, kind of, you know, that's given us a lot to think about over the years. Marriage of Heaven and Hell by William Blake is a poem, but I figured I'd add it there just because I guess I hope in some ways these like books, these like super huge books that I somehow get myself to read manage to even themselves out in a way, because I'm like, oh, well, if I just read, you know, like, sure, that William Blake poem might have taken an hour to read, no more or no less, but then again, there's also this other thing that took me, you know, 50 to 60 hours to read or something, so I know that's, like, not really a good way of thinking about, maybe, just, like, size or quantity, because there's always the impact, but I think with, you know, William Blake in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, you know. And somebody had an interesting take on that, contrasting and comparing it with Nietzsche, and how Nietzsche's, you know, going beyond kind of, you know, good and evil, obviously, you know, that's just one of his trademark things, is just like they calling for like a kind of reassessment of all these kind of what we think about morals, morality, and very black and white binary, just taking for the past traditions of just, you know, the you know, like the kind of as the bed work, I guess, of everything that we have in society today, and like without it, we're like very lost and without direction. But then there's William Blake, who has something almost like really uncannily similar with, like, he's talking about the marriage of the union of heaven and hell, and that creating like some thing like more ecstatic, less rigid, you know, because there's moments of like, he talks about, you know, demiurges. He kind of co-opts and takes that old Gnostic kind of legend of the demiurge being kind of a, was what I think they believed Yalda the Oath to be, you know, like creating this fake, fabricated world. And they basically, you know, Sophia, I think, lies, because she was so ashamed, like she, of this, like she lied and like said that like this is that everything was okay, and that this world wasn't. But it's like the world was like actually created by deceit, and it was like a mistake almost, and that Adam was created in that similar vein of, that's why you have a lot of like jealous God, vengeful God of the Old Testament, and like all these guys like Marcion, or what's the name of the one? Not Origin. I mean, Origin, like Tertullian, I think they were like the kind of OG kind of theologian church fathers, before there was even a papacy, like up there, even before there was a pope. So you had like him and like people like maybe Hippolytus. Some of them were a little bit more privy or a little bit partial or just like towards Gnosticism, just because like some of them were claimed of being Docetism, as in they didn't believe Christ had an actual physical body, but he came through a phantom kind of form. And yeah, I don't know why I'm getting into this, but this idea that, you know, the world is created as a fabrication. It's like, you know, this, and it's not that Yalda Oath, you know, he's kind of like a lower level. It's not like, this is what I like about Gnosticism, because it's not like a black and white, good and evil, angels and devils. There are angels and devils, but like there's daemons, like, you know, as I think like Jesus in the Gospel according to Judas, which is one of the kind of Gnostic kind of, I think from the Nassans, I think, or maybe the Nag Hammadi, I don't know. But yeah, he says, "Get away from me, you daemon," but he uses it in the Greek sense of the term, you know, the old Socratic daemon of, you know, someone that's, I think he said that, like kind of a voice of reason, but like kind of a voice of, you know, of reason that has yet to have known true gnosis, or has yet to have been integrated into the pleroma. And, you know, I'm just throwing out terms at this point. Anyway, but yeah, I like how William Blake with the Urizen, I think the name, with that, you know, like that classic, the hammer and striking or the anvil, you know, like very Greco kind of imagery, drawing a lot from that, but also very Nouveau as well, because he was Enlightenment age, so he was right around the time of just enlightenment of the minds, and like everybody was like high on Voltaire and Kant and Schopenhauer, but William Blake was at the same, you know, but it was also when everybody was like super impoverished and they just had horrible, like they didn't even have like a total dearth of labor laws too. Like with William Blake, he basically tried to advocate, I think, a good amount of his time for underage children that were, you know, kind of leased into working against their will most of the time, just to kind of get by and support their families. And he was like, you know, very much against that, and that shows, I think, you know, that kind of a moralistic kind of streak he had. But yeah, anyway, so Flatland by Edward Abbott in May. This is May, by the way. Yeah, an interesting little take on, as much as I am horrible at mathematics, I do like how he was able to kind of break it down. And this is a literal, this guy from, I think it was a bishop, or no, I'm sorry, not a bishop, just a cleric, like a local cleric, I think, from like the 1880s, I think, wrote this book. So it's like going on, you know, well over 200 something years, and like, and it's like interesting that this book has been, categorized, utilized to such an extent, because it's talks so much about it's so simple. It's a simple story, but it's also like a love story too, like in 3 different acts, and it follows a structure, and like a circle or like a square in like the rectangular 2D land falls in love with a spherical kind of thing that's like, or maybe it's a rectangular prism. So obviously that's 3D, so he has to kind of, for the sake of love, to actually climb through and like find a way to get into that other dimension, and I'm not really quite sure how he does it. Terminology was lost on me, I won't lie. Like, I'm horrible at math, but I also don't want to use that as an excuse either, because, I would like to get better at the things that I'm not good at, so I hope naturally. But yeah, Flatland describes it in, very interesting, but also at the same time is accessible too. I think, like, maybe not to me, but this idea of like 2D, like infinite dimensions, like how many different dimensions are there? I think that's pretty fascinating. Like, there's so many, so many different ways of seeing these things. But yeah, Being a Nothingness by Jean-Paul Sartre. I read this when, I basically, there's a lot of pressure in the back of my head to go from his shorter kind of brief works like Nausea or like No Exit and other stories. Like, I wanted to kind of move from there and try to be like, okay, well, let's try his like great big thing. And I had so happened that my parents had, or in my parents' library they had a copy of it, so I was like, oh well. It was like, the front cover with Sartre's face is like all like, it's an old copy, so it's like the parched, it's pretty worn out and weathered, so I have to be kind of careful with that kind of stuff. There's a number of little books like that I was actually able to find already in their library, so I was like, oh, no point in buying a new one. And but yeah, there's also a weird thing too with like textbooks too. Like, I'm not sure about Sartre stuff, but like I know that Ian McGilchrist, like I was trying to get some of his stuff, and it is like really just like insanely expensive on Amazon, like even used copies. I think there might be a big disparity between used and stuff like unused, because I think it's like a weird thing where like now that the person who has it, they're like gonna try to get a good price off of it or something, so it turns into an eBay kind of bartering system. But yeah, it's just weird, I guess, and maybe not, maybe I shouldn't be surprised, because it's like an academic textbook. I think anything like that, say for maybe what you could get on like like I don't know about like Bertrand Russell's like, and Alfred White North's like mathematics thing or whatever. I think certain things that might be in the public domain, obviously you can just go on there, stuff with like Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, a lot of the Russian authors of like the 1800s, a lot of them you can actually just get off of Project Gutenberg too. Like, there's not, it just depends on like the translation too. Like, it might not be something that might be a faithful translation, but like at least it's like something to have, especially when this stuff adds up and it's just like, oh well, I didn't realize I was spending this much money on books. Like, I think like there's a thing, Jorge Luis Borges said something interesting about like him. It was like in the various things of his fictions, I think like one of his stuff was like more of a kind of personal essay he had, where he was just talking about how he considered a good way of spending money, and like that could change. Like, for him, like it could also be like a simple kind of spending a few, like he could spend like a few a pretty penny maybe on like certain books and like get like a lot out of it, but he might not, or it might be a cheap book, it might be used, and he might that he can get at an antique place or whatever, and that could very much also be something very like formative and like insightful way. So yeah, there's certain things like way money's perceived as very subjective, I think. So yeah, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections by Carl Jung. This is obviously attempt of going through all of Jung's, which I've yet to even scrape the surface of, because, there's just not only that, but there's also a lot of unpolished stuff too, like, or stuff that's just come to light, excuse me, more recently. So, but yeah, he's basically just recalling, I think it was the last book he published, and it's basically him recalling all his, memories, dreams, and reflections, really. He's just like, can't really get more clear than that, but yeah, there's, a lot of, like, interesting, like, I think that's when he brought up certain things, like how he, first kind of got, like, a weird kind of taste of synchronicity when he saw that there was, like, a bird that came down. That was, like, kind of a funny story, but I don't know if he intended it to be funny, but, yeah, there's a bird came down to, like, above the chapel that he was in, because he was, like, born into Switzerland, I think, so he was right by this lake, I guess, in this chapel, like a very kind of, beautiful, obviously Switzerland's a beautiful country, and with a very fresh air, which is very clean, like you just breathe in the air, at least for me, like it's just very, just like refreshing and just like clean. I don't know other way to put it, just like, but yeah, this bird came by, and like right when the service was going on, like this bird, I think he like went to the bathroom all over the place. It's just like and he was like wrestling in his head, like as a kid, how on earth, like how does this place become this place which is like a sacrosanct kind of, the vestry and all that, is just like, how is it that, right at the moment that the, this priest says his holy rites and stuff like that, this bird takes it, and like a huge crap on the place. I don't know, it's just like but yeah, and then there's other things too, like he talks about like his interesting way that he realized the taste of the shadow too, of like when these kids were like, other bullies were, basically trying to eke out of him something, like, I don't know if like it was the classic, if it was lunch money in those days, but whatever it was, they were just arguing and hectoring him, and he was just like, all of a sudden, just in a burst of just zeal, just took one of the kids, and then started swinging him around and then hitting all the other kids down, and that was, to him, that was the shadow, that was like the kind of the repressed kind of, I guess, sensation part of him, that was like, just, I thought that was pretty interesting, the way he kind of, because I feel like I've had moments like that where it's like, I can be placid and kind of conflict avoidant, and then all of a sudden something like stakes getting high, and it's like, I can kind of tell there's a moment when I'm just like, not violence, but like, I'm maybe it's a pathetic, or maybe it's a good thing that I've never been in a fight, like I've never been, fisticuffs with somebody. I've been in near yelling matches with people, but, in my worst moments, but I haven't, but, there's been moments where I've seen certain aspects of me, especially in my younger days, just like seeing like, out of nowhere, like it's just like another side, I was like, oh, I didn't know I was like able to do that, or, interesting. Some might say like hysterical strength. They might even say that in moments like of extreme stress, you're like picking up a car, and maybe you're a skinny guy and you're like 5'5", yet you pick up this enormous car, that's like 3 times your weight, and it's like, I think things like that kind of get like weird, like I'm not really sure what to think about that, because it's like you're making these kind of, now you're getting out of the psychological territory, and now you're going to like actual empirical claims. You're saying like, okay, well, this person obviously, anyway. Picture of Dorian Gray, obviously did a review of that. Obviously nothing much to say about Oscar Wilde. Interesting. I forgot to visit his grave when I was in France, but apparently there's a grave where all the adoring fans go to like kiss on his grave, I think, on the gravestone, which is pretty interesting. But yeah, he basically fled Ireland, because Ireland was in a similar way that Beckett and Joyce did, more so Joyce, but I'm sure Beckett probably wanted to kind of scare it out of there at some point too. He basically had a lot of you know, obviously homosexual, you know, in those times was like, you know, a big no-no, and he was just like, okay, well, screw it, I'm going to France. So he ended up going there, where he kind of create, you know, and pretty much do what he wanted with less. I'm sure even France in those days too was probably, you know, pretty nice, but I think anyway. But at least we're not as bad as what is it, like ISIS? Like this is like literally like almost a decade ago, but they probably still do it. But you know, like throwing gays off of buildings, like basically literally just toppling, or you know, bringing them, even like this one older guy on a wheelchair, basically just pushing him off the building to his death. But yeah, it's just like, you know, like, not to use that old cliche of like, hey, we don't have it that bad, but you know, it does make you think sometimes. Anyway, Swann's Way, Marcel Proust. I did a review of this. I'm currently slowly, digesting, I guess, ingesting it, and I'm trying to make sure I read it very slow, because I don't want to just rush through it, because I feel like I did that with Jean-Mart's Way, because I think the best way, as Haruki Murakami said through one of his characters, I can't remember which, I think it was one of the characters from Kafka on the Shore, but he said the best way to actually read Proust is not in normal conditions, but like if you were a prisoner confined against your will, to actually just completely indulge and like read all of his, you know, to have total time to focus on that, which also reminds me a lot of Stefan Zweig in the chess, you know, the Royal Game, yeah, where he's talking about, you know, the narrator of that saying like the only way to actually get really, really, really good at chess is to be in solitary confinement, in which he found himself under, was it like, I did a review of that too, by the way. Anyway, but I think you get the point. The Trouble with Being Born. Sorry, the screen is hurting my eyes. It's just, I don't know. Even though I've been staring on it for who knows how many years. The Trouble with Being Born by Emil Cioran. So this book I actually not huge on, because I think it's aphoristic in the kind of way that Nietzsche's sentiments are, or maybe a bit like Montaigne, but Montaigne if he wasn't so freaking depressing. I just didn't really get I did hear essays and stuff and other people's take of him before, and I do know that he did, you know, he suffered, you know, having the loss of like a really good dear friend of his, like right before he or right around when he wrote that, excuse me. And I do know that kind of, you know, attributed a lot of where it was coming from, of just like, you know, kind of a pessimistic outlook, you know, just like completely, you know, like there's no point in going outside. He didn't say this, but you know, like there's no point in doing this, no point in trying, no point in doing anything. And you get that. I get that. That's really hard, you know, when you're, especially if you're in Europe. You know, he's Romanian, came from Romania, kind of broken, kind of fallen country in a lot of ways. I haven't been there, but my sister had for like a mission trip, and she, you know, talked about like, you know, decommissioned kind of old, Soviet era kind of like bases and stuff with like lots of like artillery stuff that was like, you know, now decommissioned, and you know, I thought, you know, I just could only picture, you know, that, and then the whole reign of Ceausescu too, Nicolae Ceausescu, which is like really one of the most probably, you know, I don't want to say hunting kind of executions, but like the way it was done was just very rushed. It was just very like, you know, like it was so horrible the way they described it. Even though they're horrible, awful people, but I'm not trying to, you know, have pity for them. But I just felt, you know, like the way one of the executioners was like saying that like, you know, Nicolae Ceausescu, like he smelled decent, you know, like at least he bothered to, you know, have some modicum of hygiene, but his wife just smelled like completely like a rank rat or something. He was just like, so she smelled like she was already dead. And I'm like, oh, okay, you guys really hate her. And I get, you know, the bile that can accrue under that when you're under that kind of totalitarian kind of regime for so long. But anyway, but yeah, I can understand Sharon fleeing. I'm not sure when, it was obviously before that, not before the 80s, late 80s when this was. So it's probably, I want to say, what this 50s, I think? 50s, 60s. But yeah, I'll give him another chance. I don't know, I'm not big on, like, his writing style. It's, like, a little bit too recycles things, and then he's, like, I think there's one thing that I disagree with him on Nietzsche, when he was talking about Nietzsche in a way of, like, Nietzsche saying yes to life, I think, and then he was, like, saying, like, why bother, or something like that, or, he stated it much more eloquently, but, So, the Phenomenology of Spirit, George Friedrich Hegel, I took forever, and, yeah, it went in one ear and out the other. I cannot remember a thing. I do have a slight grasp on, like, the general kind of consensus on Hegel's philosophy. It was like, he was going towards, what was it? He was against, like, he was towards kind of a materialism that was more absolute spirit, like towards kind of dialectical. It wasn't the dialectical materialism of Marx, I don't think, with a really big political leanings of, like, it's the dialectical of, like, master slaves, kind of thing that Hegel actually started, but I think Marx kind of went off and, like, took Hegel's stuff, and he was like, it's his Hegelian spirit, and it's like it's dialectical material, it has to be Hegel, and then he was like, no, but he left the spirit by, I don't know if that's exactly what it was going. He left this, the spirit of, because it was everything. It's like Wes Cecil has a really good lecture on this. I like the way he breaks down these, kind of intimidating philosophers. But yeah, there's something that we're working towards, like arcing towards in the future. It's like, Hegel thinks that he's actually quite optimistic in a kind of layman's terms, because he thinks that we're all heading somewhere. There's a purpose, a telos end goal. Like, we're all, sure, there's a kind of material way we go about it, but, like, there is some spirit. Like, it'd be absolute, and it's not like a new age kind of way of saying spirit. It's not saying, it's more like a panentheism, I think. Like, it's more of a, not pantheism, pan meaning all, and theism, obviously, I think, is more aligns with Spinoza's God, like, Spinoza was very, he's part of the rationalists, but his God of the universe is more of a God of order, and this is where we hear, obviously, the most quoted kind of thing from Einstein and Spinoza, and all. So, anyway, that's a quick diversion, I guess, but yeah, I think with, Hegel, that's why Schopenhauer hated Hegel. No, he was, like, resented him. He as others have pointed out, Schopenhauer would spend, in the history coming from, actually read or, listened to the world as will and representation. So I have some measure of, knowledge, I guess, on the subject. But yeah, he took very little time, he took, most of the entire thing, like the entirety of his work, of, world as well, he doesn't actually mention, like, anything, like, he doesn't indulge in anything, like, he doesn't say anything about Hegel, but, like, the second he does, it's like, he mentions Hegel, like, multiple, I think it's like a dozen times, I couldn't remember, but it's just, like, very, very ridiculous amount, but, like, he doesn't actually go off the deep, he doesn't use this personal kind of vindictive language. He's very descriptive. He's very, like, this is as as I'm just describing things, I'm not prescribing a philosophy, but, then he full on just kind of, like, puts, throws those to the wolves and just, like, completely just indulges, like, in vindicating Hegel and just, like, making him out to be the worst person. Which, who knows, he might have been, he was more popular than Schopenhauer, he was more kind of well-liked among his students in Germany. And he actually got to see it. It was pretty interesting. Like, he actually kind of witnessed from, like, kind of almost like a third eye view or whatever, like, from a distance, Napoleon, like, he saw, like, Napoleon as it was, like, kind of like a spirit of the age of, like, history. Like, he wasn't saying Napoleon was a good person, he was just saying, like, Napoleon was, like, this, kind of was just emblematic of some of this kind of history being history, like, in taking from the past and, this dialectical history of, like, we need, rather than tossing out all of, history, I think what Napoleon might have been doing is, like, kind of just, like, wiping clean and being like, you know what, I'm just gonna seize what I want, the great men of society, which isn't a Nietzschean concept. It's actually misattributed to him falsely. But anyway, this idea that, he's just seizing what's yours and taking, the lay of the land. But anyway, so Theory of Everything by Ken Wilber. This was actually one of his shorter works. I just wanted to get introduced to him. For those who don't know, Ken Wilber's a pretty well-known kind of, but also almost a little bit underground punk in a sort of way. Known for integral theory, which is quite, I think he theorized in the 70s. He's still alive. He's probably in his 70s now, but I think in the 1960s and 70s he started having, combining all these different things because he is so almost hermetic in a sense. He's going back and forth, but he's also, I take from him that he's schooled in Buddhism. Like, he's, like, gone the full route of, of this, maybe the Sam Harris kind of psychedelic trip, leaving behind kind of the pleasures and seductions of the quiet life, I guess, of suburbia, and then going to, I don't know if he went to, I'm sure he's probably been, at least, Ken Wilber, went that route of, and he's also, so he's got the mindfulness thing down, the meditation as, practice, and he's also gone the route of, like, the scientist, psychologist, and, like, has done a lot of orientation and kind of reassessment of, like, what's going on now, and, like, all this different stuff, and then he's also gone, like, kind of, so the Buddhist spiritual, this, and then he's gone, like, the progressive kind of activist. He's seen that and been privy to stuff like that, or at least, I think. And then he's also, there's different 4 quadrants I'm trying to combine, because it's like, that's what he does, is, like, he's basically, with integral theory, is that each one of these things of, like, there's different ways of, like, I think he said, like, the upper green, I think, and, like, the left yellow or something. I'm not quite sure. You can look on Wikipedia, but they have they have the image of the basic integral theory template set up, but it's a heuristic, to kind of give people to be like, okay, well, we're not going to be dogmatic about any one thing. And you might say that he's simplifying, reducing all these concepts to, like, very simplistic kind of hierarchies. But I think in that sense he's been kind of compared to Jordan Peterson, I think. But I think he's actually kind of more almost diverse, inclusive than Jordan Peterson. He actually had a thing on Jordan Peterson. He had an opinion that's really interesting that I recommend listening to. You just look up Ken Wilber on Jordan Peterson. But yeah, he had an interesting, because I think he was saying that, like, Jordan Peterson was actually mistaken for, that he said that he actually agreed with quite a bit of his views, and that Jordan Peterson, I think the reason the whole, with the C-14 bill in Canada with, like, the whole gender pronouns and all that, the reason that's happened is because there's been the 70s, I think, and 80s, I think, the older generation, the boomers, sorry. I think many of them are part of a generation where the progressives back then were, the kind of in line with maybe the classical liberals and, like, all the, they're pretty, they're used today because things are so regressive. And then there's also the regressive kind of way where it's just, like, take everything to its logical conclusion, screw the opposition, like, completely just, like, burn down this entire world if people don't accept the pronoun thing, and they just die on that hill, like other people who are extremely dogmatic with, I just love the word dogmatic, it's so all-encompassing, catch-all, but yeah, if people who die on that hill of the sovereign nation thing, where they're just like, I have my rights and this and that, they get killed, and I think the reason people, and I think it's totally, maybe that's apples and oranges, because, like, I think the whole gender, this SJW kind of route of really regressive thinking has less backlash, I think, like, but I'm not really sure how in the weeds I want to get in this, but there is something to be said about, not being a holistic way of looking at morality, and like seeing that, like, hey, okay, so in this quadrant we have religion, and religion has some things that are good in this sense. It's Hegelian, because you're looking towards the past to kind of learn from it and to reassess things. But religion also has really bad things. Like, we shouldn't wield it over others. We shouldn't make inquisitions. We shouldn't, go on killing sprees in the name of God. That's totally whack. We should, make sure this is. But at the same time, we can also see that there's a need for ritual and this and that. So I think that's, sifting things out and seeing how they add up. That's why what I like about Ken Wilber. But then there are also the people, I think, oddly enough, what's his name? Mark Manson, I think, who did Subtle Art of Not Giving Enough. I used to make fun of that book title just because I thought it was like one of those hustler bros that did it. No, I thought it was just one of those like hustle kind of screw that stuff, read Stoicism, man, and, mispronounced Epictetus and then take a cold shower. But I kind of misunderstood what he was getting. And he knows kind of what he's talking. When he was like talking about the reason he called that was kind of subvert people's expectations and and to kind of like, because it was such a commonly held ideal, like to care exactly, to care what people think, and there's a subtle art to not caring about what people think while taking accountability for your actions and doing stuff and not being totally edgelord, stuff with it. So he has some interesting stuff. But he said he was a follower of Ken Wilber, and that there's something I got the rise and fall of Ken Wilber, but I'm not sure how much I take away from that. I still think I still have his, I'm still intending on reading his stuff, but I'm doing this all at kind of from as best of an objective standpoint as I can, like not being too, Ken Wilber, or, Mark Manson said that Ken Wilber got super, hypocritical, and then had people, come to his meetings and all these, integral kind of theory kind of meetings where people could come together, but they all had to pay a price to get into price of admission and all this stuff. And it's just like, I'm not sure how, and like stuff like you had to wait hours and hours. I can't quite remember, but yeah, it's just, I'm not quite sure. I think like there's ups and downs of everything, like anything you take, if you get into a new kind of ideal and a movement, wholeheartedly, I think, but I think being mindful of where you're going and like what you're going. I wouldn't say he's fallen. I don't think. It's not like he's got like accused of Harvey Weinstein-esque or levels of like, past ugly, skeletons in the closet, at least not yet, I don't think. But anyway, so after that in June I read, I forgot, Aeon by Carl Jung. I read that in April as well. I'm sorry, not April. May, sorry. Aeon by Carl Jung. Okay, so that's another one he's talking about. I think that's the one where he mentions Christ as simple as itself. I should make separate videos on this, but I'm going to try to roll through this. But yeah, Aeon's, definitely recommend that. Down the line, if people want, I'd say, like, don't read that first. Like, don't read the Red Book by Carl Jung. I'd probably start with, like, The Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious first. And then maybe Modern Man in Search of a Soul, which I always get mixed up with Man's Search for Meaning. Similar sentiments, but, yeah, definitely, kind of glad I did wait a little bit till I read certain, like this. And I'm definitely going to have to reread it, because it's, like, something in middle age you definitely look at differently, too. Just in the same way with, like, the Kabbalah or Jewish mysticism, like, certain people only accept, between the age of 35 to 40 is like the kind of ripe kind of age of being like ready for these very like personal self-developmental things where they're not held down by anything. So okay, so June I read Faust part 2, I'm sorry. Part 1 I read like some years back. I did notice that, Goethe is very, the whole thing's in, like, I don't know if I reviewed this, but I should soon. But, yeah, it's, obviously, Faust is, this genius scientist, right? And it's basically a kind of resuscitation of the old, medieval myth as well. And it's just, like, kind of, the limits of immortality and the limits of genius, and But yeah, Faust 2 just kind of goes, picks up kind of where it left off, but it's like a Faust later on in age, and things trying to tie things up. I think like people kind of generally, the consensus was that Goethe kind of lost his flair a little bit and kind of lost, and this is the lesser part that people kind of don't really, or like he kind of lost his spark a little bit in the second part. But then I read The First Man by Albert Camus. I found that upon first reading much more invigorating than the Fall. But it was not to say that the Fall requires second reading, but I did really like that the image that invoked it. But yeah, The First Man is like proto-biblical in a sense, or not proto, but neo-biblical in the sense that it's mentioning that this man that, what was it? He's born to parents that don't have. That's why he's called the first man, because he's actually born from parents that of a generation that died or something. Or it's the way he told it around. Like it made sense when I described it. I can't remember, but it's like this man that It's almost like a lonely kind of Benjamin Button type of way I got from this thing where he's like has this weird condition, and it's like it marks him forever from that's something that's just always hanging on his head. Like he's just like can't shake it. In a sense, that's why it's existential, I guess. Is like he's trying to not be defined by his birthright, and yeah. But definitely, I'm gonna have to reread that one. But there's something very interesting about that. Premise of it. Closer to God by Meister Eckhart. Yeah, I heard about him before. Kind of a mystical German. Not sure if he's a Trappist monk or not. I think there's a cloister. He was definitely in a cloister. I know that, but yeah, he had a lot to say about spirituality, and not to kind of, a tough, not just the kind of like, here, let's just restate what we believe over and over again, or, he had I think his stuff aligned with quietism. I think with this idea of getting totally immersed in the idea of God, of just loving, just getting yourself, denying the world in favor of God, and to get that, as a way of like, catharsis, I think, yeah. So yeah, The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. Somebody recommended this to me. I think one of my editors. Because they said I think that like some of my stuff in my book slightly reminded him of that, which was weird because I hadn't even heard of her before. I read that, but yeah, there's science fiction. I do like that she's kind of more in the Philip K. Dick route of speculative fiction and like alternate history, like what could be, rather than kind of the L. Ron Hubbard. Not to like really, because I'm not really sure if I really know all that much about L. Ron Hubbard, or if he fits in with the paperback kind of pulp novel guy that's of like magazines and like something prose odd of like there's something North Wind of the something, and Star Trek too, which is I never got into Star Trek because of like, and I know maybe I'm like there is something to be, not to throw out everything about Star Trek, but there is something just it's escapist about it. Like you're making this other world, and you're just kind of using that as like a I don't know, like something like it feels like fantasy can be like that too, like sci-fi fantasy. But with Ursula K. Le Guin is that it's like actually stuff that could happen, like The Left Hand of Darkness, I think, deals with a weird type of race that can't reproduce. I think they're asexual, and this other person is like who's of a kind of a race more similar to our own. It might just be future humans. But yeah, it's like I think they're kind of paired up with one of these alien people, and yeah, I'm totally lost on like what happened after that. But yeah, it's like they're kind of like, I think they end up like somewhere in the Arctic, in an Arctic kind of cold tundra, and they're the way they both handle it, I think, is like very different from the get go. But yeah, it's just an interesting way of like describing like what would happen if we if that were the case, like if we if some permutation of some biological specimen in the future was like that, you know. After that was The Masterpiece by Emile Zola. I heard that there was a dozen or so novels that Zola made, and he was a naturalist, and I've yet to review this. I should, but yeah, he was in a natural school, which was to portray people just as they are without any glamorizations. No, so that's why Monet, the painter Monet, shows up too, and that's what The Masterpiece is kind of directly referencing culturally. I know he was highly against, Zola was against the anti-Semitic inspired seize of or arrest of Alfred Dreyfus too, which is like a big stir in France, especially world over too. Even without email and news outlets yet. So the internet, but yeah, it's like that kind of frailty, that kind of miscarriage of justice too, is what I think he called it. And there's like a lot of his work was like more anti-censorship, and that's why Monet, the painter, not Claude Monet, I think it's a different Monet, French too, but Impressionist, maybe not, I'm not sure if he was, but he made a famous portrait called the something picnic, I think. It's a picnic near in a park, and it's like it shows a woman uncovered, like she's topless, I think. And it caused like a great stir, I think, in France too, because people were like, oh well, this isn't good for our children's eyes. And Monet was about naturalism, showing things as they are. In essence, that's what Zola did. He kind of recreated that kind of thing with a masterpiece created by a mastermind, a kind of artist that's, falls in love with a younger girl who shows up one day outside his house, I think, and she's kind of a bit lost, I think, a bit, not sure, like she's a bit, you just had a brain fart. yeah, she's a bit lost and like doesn't know where to go, and then he's like offers her to stay in his house, and then he's like, well, can I paint you too? And then he ends up like forming this kind of like interesting kind of relationship, almost a trope at this point, I guess. The kind of the singular mastermind kind of like, and you see it in Phantom Thread, which I really love, with Daniel Day-Lewis, Paul Thomas Anderson film with and Vicky Krieps, I think her name is. But yeah, there's that kind of dynamic of the artist in the muse, so I think it was exploring that kind of thing, which I liked, because other things, like there's other things I tried reading by Zola and Balzac that kind of flew over my head, where I was like, with like Eugene Grantin, I think I read that and I completely went over my head. All you know is it has to do with an abuser by the name of one of the Father Grantin, I think one of the patriarchs of the family, is like an abusive, horrible person, very stingy, but that's all I got from it. It was like him and his abuses, and I'm gonna have to reread that, so this is the thing. So anyway, The Prophet by Khalil Gibran is a tiny little book. I have it here somewhere. I think it's this, yeah, or the broken, it's not it, but that's another problem. It's an excuse for me to get away from the screen. Anyway, that's actually horizontally filmed, so I can't really see it. Anyway, but yeah, it's a thin little thing. It took me an evening, or a couple evenings, spaced out. I recommend reading it slow, but it's like very methodical. I want to review this, but yeah, it's very simple, like a prophet coming to this land, of semi-fictional, because I'm mixing him up. Khalil Gibran, I want to say, was not Iranian, but Saudi Arabian, I think. And yeah, it was a pretty famous book too. It was a bestseller, I think, for the time. And this prophet character of coming and prophesizing all these different things, but not like messages of doom, really, but more messages of like, love one another, treat one another with respect, and it sounds a bit cliche, but I'm obviously paraphrasing highly. But yeah, it's like a quick read. I think that's why it was able to get resonated so well with a bunch of people, because it was easily translatable too. Like, it didn't take a whole lot of time. Anyway, so The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. Obviously I did a thing of this. Thomas Mann was working my way, and still am. There's another one I think called Joseph and His Brothers that I've yet to read, and I feel bad that I haven't read it yet, because I love Thomas Mann, obviously. I think I've reviewed multiple, at least maybe 3 of his books, maybe 4. And yeah, I'd like to definitely work my way through the rest of them. The Man Who Mistook His Wife for His Hat by Oliver Sacks. A very funny story about a man who did mistake his wife. I've got to do a review of this. I have it written down on the to-do list. Believe it or not, I do have a to-do list. But it's like, wait, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for His Hat by Oliver Sacks was passed away semi-shortly. I want to say like 2015, 2016. Robin Williams played him, by the way, in Awakenings, which I've yet to read. It's Awakenings is more a dramatic memoir, but there's a bit of a interesting kind of comicality and like humor, kind of dark humor, black humor to this book. I really liked how you feel bad for these old people too, like these old people with Alzheimer's, dementia, and they start with aphasia too. With like your communication style is just it's lacking. Like, you can't communicate, right? And I've seen people with aphasia or some signs of it, dementia. My father had with Huntington's, like that kind of came out with like a big, just awful kind of combination of all these different things, and like that, it just seemed to get worse and compounding about the day with different kinds of dementia, and then also like vague signs of like obsessive compulsive, like before that with him, like just being really obsessive about closing drawers or hanging up, the phone if it's off the hook, just really things like that, which might have just been something unrelated to Huntington's, but, he had different kinds of mental kind of neurodegenerative things going on. And that's, Huntington's is like a combination of like, kind of like Lou Gehrig's and ALS, but mostly once you get to the age when it gets worse and you're in middle age. So yeah, definitely that man with Oliver Sacks, this man, the poor guy that did mistake his wife for his hat. And then there was also another person who kept having weird dreams, I think. I'm gonna have to reread a little bit of that, but yeah, there's Psychological Types by Carl Jung, obviously. Going through the cognitive functions he talks about, brings up kind of the differences between certain things like the heart. I think the heart diastole. I think the Goethe is a quote that he used to kind of preface it, I think, which really makes me think. Yeah, I'm not sure how much I want to get into this, because it is something I might just make a separate video on. But yeah, I did like how in the Psychological Types, he ordered out like these things, but like, he didn't make anything, structure. Like, he didn't define and say like everybody abides in these. He just said like in a general way people have prefaces like for introversion or extroversion, which are still used today thanks to Jung. But yeah, there's, I think a lot of it opened up different things with like Isabel Myers-Briggs. Nothing against her, but like she kind of took it a little bit differently. And then there's like the different kind of Keirsey kind of temperaments too. So, and then the Enneagram as well. And but yeah, I did like it talked about certain things like the shadow and like the these different things, like how and that this certain kind of air that people with certain types had, like people with intuition, like introverted intuition, might seem cranky, or people with extroverted intuition might seem very kind of just inventive and constantly thing, whereas maybe people with an introverted sensation might have a little bit of a misanthropic kind of thing. But I'm not too sure. Like, he said these are general things. Like, one might presume that these people might have these traits as a common thing. That's just his experience too. Like, it hasn't been lab tested. I mean, I don't know how exactly you would do that, but yeah. So after that, The Pale King by David Foster Wallace. That was his last novel. It was actually unfinished. I'd like to do a review of this, but yeah, I think original unpublished manuscript had like something like over like 1,100 pages. So yeah, it was pretty intense. Talked a lot, about footnotes too. Is like I know Wallace is crazy with his footnotes, notoriously so, and like the way the way he wields language too, like the way it just like he talks from like all these different kind of lenses, different character lenses. He uses that almost as a way of not exegesis, almost as a way of Dostoevsky kind of polyphonic way of like, let's hear every different worldview here. Like we have from the point of view of maybe the kind of dyspeptic kind of older middle-aged office worker guy that's doesn't know how to talk to a woman versus the girl, like like you have this big dialogue kind of thing at in the bar, I think later on in the novel, and how there's both like they interact and like like Wallace is privy, he's able to kind of create that, because that's a great thing about creative fiction too, is like you're not limited with it too. It's like the sky's the limit, but not even the sky's the limit, because if you're talking metaphysics, I don't know what I'm saying. Oh, okay. The pale. Okay, I already said that. Oh, another thing about the book, I liked that quote from there's something about the IRS, the IRS agents, the whole thing with that, and how one of their bosses like saying like, okay, if you're gonna go into this, think of it as like a religion or something. Like think of this, as not just filing taxes. Like this is so boring that if you're going to do this, you have to kind of create a narrative. And he didn't say this word for word, generously paraphrasing here, but like this, you're going to have to create some meaning for yours. Like you're going to have to make this thing, like go to work with like you have to be so like, I think he said religious about the mundane, like the very insignificant. Like you have to be on fire about these things. And it's just like, that nobody would say that in real life, obviously. Okay, and that would be otherwise. I would be probably the best boss ever, because all of us have had super boring jobs of just whether it's filing taxes, stuff that we do self-induced, or whether it's just stuff that we do just to make a living. More often it's the latter. I hear, at least. But yeah, I've had jobs where I've like felt like I was going insane because of how monotonous it is and how much repetition it engenders. Like, it just, we're here, same shit, different day, nothing changed, just continuing down the pipeline, just chasing money. And yeah, and it's like, you start to wonder and you question it. So it's like one of those things where it's like, you know what, if I'm going to do this, might as well, be you have to. And that's the thing too. It's like you almost like, I think another thing he said was, each one of us has our own gods and stuff we choose to worship. It's like we all have our own hidden type of gods. So that's that, which I find like that's generally true. I think like a lot of us, we act as if, even if we're atheistic, we kind of have some preposition, even if we're so materialistic, just like, not in consumerist way, but just a materialism way, as in a, necessitarianism, I guess, is another word. We become so, infatuated with this kind of like maybe the intellect side and the rational side. So we make that our God. And, we all have the different things we choose to be God about. The people who are maybe very charitable and give to, they may make themselves gods in a way, because they're like, I'm going to go to all these countries and gentrify and give these people and do this stuff, and it's like you've made yourself apotheosis or God or whatever. Anyway, so Brief Videos with Hideous Men, another DFW book. I like this one. I think it was a movie by John Krasinski directed. I've never seen it, but it has, it's obviously of the same name, adaptation. And yeah, I liked this idea again of one takeaway I'm trying to do with every one of these books, I think, is this idea that like some of these men that they're thinking about women, like the way they treat women and like the way they go through things, and like some of them are super aware of it too, like they're just like, that's what makes it kind of like weirdly creepy too, is that like there's so many off, things that are obviously off about them, and they're like, I know that, I'm like the way I use women and the way I treated that woman when I dated her. I knew I was sociopathic, whatever, and it's just like kind of weird because it's like you usually think, and obviously he talks from a plethora of different things. Like there's one guy who's like talking about Viktor Frankl and like the Man's Search for Meaning, halfway through like a conversation in like a diner or something, and so yeah, there's like a lot of different things. But it's interesting the fact that you normally think of people who are psychopathic or sociopathic, which are probably two quite different things, but I think it's the common thing is like maybe a lack of empathy, but it's like this idea of them being aware that you are, but like it's another thing to not be aware, I think, and that's like the troubling aspect, I guess, of these characters, because like they almost seem like they could be real people. That's it's a great thing about creative fiction is like you can spin up stories that are like magic realism, like Horus, I guess, but I also think Horus is also psychological too. I think Horus a lot of things, so I love him. He's not strictly, the only thing he was limited to was the short story, because he didn't write a lot of novels. He wrote like collections, which are novels in a way too. But they just have different. They're a little bit more divergent, I guess. But yeah, I'd say Marquez, Gabriel Garcia Marquez is a definite. With him weaving up 100 Years of Solitude and the Bueno Dios, or the Buenenda family, Lorenzo Buenenda, the patriarch of just creating this, this world that's, completely, the Buenenda world, their little their city, like the city of Buenenda, all of us can live in harmony, and they do. It just kind of falls from there because he's like, I need solitude. He's like, I need solitude to write my masterwork. Which is kind of meta too, but it's like this interesting that he's able to get all his relatives there. And it's just like, with magic realism, you can do these things. You can twist and bend time, and you can also incorporate reality too, like the horrific Colombian banana workers in the 1928, 29, I think. That obviously drew from you draw from autobiography, true things, and then you like blend that in with the surreal or magic surreal, and then magic happens. That's me. That's just me though. Anyway, so After Dark by Haruki Murakami, I think that was his first one. I liked it. I think there's a lot of that early Murakami, a lot of like he hasn't quite found his voice, but he did. He did in the sense that there are. I know it's a common archetype, not to sound reductive, but Murakami is the passive young man between the ages of 21 to 30-ish who just kind of watches life slip him. He's like, but you identify with him because he's not like, sociopathic in the least, but just passive and like just kind of is like looking over his life for mistakes and stuff. And sometimes they work at kind of jazz nightclubs like he did, and like kind of like closing out. I think that's what After Dark is about, and like and they're very nostalgic about Beatles records in 1970s, different jazz trio records and stuff, and they're like, I'm really I have an affinity for this thing, and and that, and but they also get caught up in stuff like just like the Wind Up Bird Chronicles. It turns into kind of a weird neo-noir type of thing where it's just like it's a murder mystery, and it's like I didn't ask for this. And like the same thing with Wild Sheep Chase. So it's like a guy who's a bit like Murakami, maybe just a bit passive, and not to say I know exactly what Murakami is like because he's kept a certain level of recluse around him. Not unhealthy, not what isn't more or less expected from a lot of great writers is like kind of a degree of isolation and seclusion. And you can be pretty healthy like that. I mean, the dude runs multi-marathons. I think ultra-marathons, too. He's, when I read what we talk about when we talk about running, yeah, he talked about, the actually going to Rome. Spoil the book. Anyway. But yeah, he actually said, not Rome, I'm sorry, Thermopylae, where they actually had the Battle of Marathon to, like, actually run, like, a classic marathon. And he was saying, like, how drenching, horribly hot it was. Anyway, so next I read Michael Kohlhaas by Heinrich von Kleist. That's actually Only von Kleist. Von Kleist is hard to find. Him, certain German/Swiss, Austrian poets. Pan-Germanic, I guess, maybe. Anybody with that, or any foreign language. It's actually hard to find on not just Audible, where it's like you're just gonna find German stuff, but Michael Kohlhaas, I just got the paperback version, obviously. I liked it. It was like a little bit hard to understand because it was like talking about a very specific legend of the Kohlhaas legend of this outsider kind of outlaw, who's guy that just follows his own code of conduct, and he's like almost like a Robin Hood figure is what I got the sense from. He's like doing these things, he's kind of giving it back to these kind of debt collectors, I think, and he's exacting, and he's like punitive towards those people, but then he's like has a lot of clemency for these other people, and that's kind of what I got to see, this underdog type of thing. Almost like a kind of Nietzschean morality, I guess, Supermensch in some sense. Not to put words in his mouth, definitely, because the dude Heinrich von Kleist, we mainly know him for the murder suicide of him and I think Henrietta something. But yeah, they got so, it reminded me a bit of Osmo Dazé, or should I say Osmo Dazé reminds, or should I say the other way around? But anyway, this murder suicide is just like they obviously, at a young age, like early 30s, I think, they both took each other's lives, like he shot her and then killed himself, I think, and yeah, it was also in a sense, it was like the classic kind of romantic kind of way. But I also heard that Kafka took a decent amount of inspiration from von Kleist, so I would like to read more of his stuff as well. He's also a poet as well. In fact, I think that was his main kind of craft. The Concept of Anxiety by Soren Kierkegaard. Again, working my way through Kierkegaard. I like, not every book you read you have to like, certain. I do appreciate Kierkegaard a lot. Like there's a poetic kind of style to him. There's, I also semi-recently read The Age of Anxiety, and fun fact, I actually visited Kierkegaard's grave in Denmark. Took a little while to find because, Hans Christian Andersen. I just drawing a blank, but his grave is like really easy to find. It's fine, but I think it was kind of the way that Kierkegaard might have wanted it, not to say like, oh, like I know exactly what he would want, but he in lifetime he never was quick to kind of make himself heard, or he was like more like I'm just the gadfly guy with my faith in God, and I kind of leap of faith, and I'm going with this. I'm a knight of faith that's like walking through the streets of Copenhagen. But yeah, it's like was after finding like about an hour, and it was like a really interesting, like a pleasantly spent hour of just or so of kind of just examining all the different graves of all the different artistic, poets and writers, and kind of like in the Pantheon too. It's in Paris, you find like so many different people. It's like, oh, there's Marie Curie, there's Pierre Curie, and there's also the grave of Voltaire, I think, too. Zola's there. So you find like a lot of different people, like different walks of life, but all kind of who attribute to culture in some way. And likewise with Kierkegaard, like it's the unsung in a sense that his grave is like very simple. It was like a simple headstone for him and his. I don't know if Regine Olsen was buried next to him. I think she was nearby. I think, but like his mother and his. I think he was an only child. I'm not sure. But yeah, Kierkegaard, very interesting fellow. Emily Dickinson, Poems and Letters. Emily Dickinson. We had obviously heard of him. I don't know why I said we all of a sudden. I'd heard of her for a while. We've had books by her just in the library in access, free for us to read, and I don't know why I never read her till now, or till then, because, very reclusive artist too. And she died, painfully young too. I think like in her 30s, I think, or maybe 40s. And she had like so much of this stuff. She was a classic example of like kind of proto outside of artist too, because a lot of what she made she never published. I think until she passed away. So, in the same sense that Kafka never did publish much of anything until he died at Max Broad's behest. So, I'd like to read more of her too. On my Dixon. Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. This book kept showing up. It's one of those things like Sapiens by what's his face? You know what I'm talking about. Sapiens by he's Israeli. Totally blanking on his name, but Malcolm Gladwell. Yeah, Outliers is he's got some good points. Like putting in here 10,000 hours. And, Outliers. He's putting in good points where he wasn't. He's a great storyteller, Malcolm Gladwell, but you have to remember he's not like a scientist, he's not like a human, or he's not like a, he's a journalist first and foremost. And I'm not saying that negates anything he says. I'm just saying to look at through that lens. And even he says like, hey, I'm just asking questions here. I'm just a curious guy who's interested about these statistics and what makes them. And he did have an interesting thing on the the first chapter. I think he was talking about this certain tribe. Not tribe, but sect or kind of family, kind of unit of people, not discreetly put together, but kind of like just ancestry, just by shared common ancestry, who had this kind of blood. I can't remember what ethnicity, but it was a kind of they were like immune to heartburn, or it was the other way around. For some reason they kept dying early, and they had like this horrible thing with like heart issues, heart disease, and everybody was like dying of heart attacks early. I'm very rusty on it, but yeah, it's just like this. The idea was that he was bringing. I think it was like, is it a nurture or is it nature? Like, what is it that creates? Like, why is it that we have these strange, inherited traits that, like, at our detriment? Like, it almost doesn't make sense evolutionary. So I think that's his point. But he said about other things, like the Beatles too, like a famous example of like. They got their 10,000 hours by playing on these horrible shows that seemed to get them nowhere, in that they basically accumulated more or less that amount of hours of just practicing and getting cussed out and ridiculed on stage and getting over those things and stuff that I've never gotten over because I've never been on stage, or I've been on stage but not nearly as many times. Well, in like maybe a handful of times, but yeah. Yeah, but just certain things like that, like that there's another aspect to the musicianship aside from just being able to play, in theory, good guitar, or play scales, or on the piano. There's like another, there's like a, being like thriving under pressure kind of thing that I think like they had to get used to. But yeah, he's got some interesting points there. Not that I'm saying everything gets at heart, because I think like certain things, like I think it was like a combination of luck. And funnily enough, he actually mentions Oppenheimer there, like almost poisoning his teacher. But yeah, there's also, he said something like, there's like with Bill Gates, like he was obviously just lucky. He inherited like wealth. He inherited opportunities, at least at any rate, and and there's obviously questionable things about Bill Gates, but I think there's. One thing is that, like, it was like, he put in, like, a certain amount of work to get really, really good at coding, to take, these seminars and camps and stuff like that. So he got in all that time, and it was, like, a combination of that and also knowing the right people. So, yeah, it's, like, an interesting theory, I guess. The Red Book by Carl Jung, another Jungian book. Again, very, very deep and mystical. One of the parts about it that I'm just going to make a separate thing on that. But yeah, the Red Book was very something that, again, you have to reread in middle age because there's just so much to glean from it. But it's his most personal. I think it's Jung without, through the lens of like a scientist, psychologist, and Jung was very much an educated guy. He went to like Bristol University, the place where Nietzsche was kind of born and bred, his Nietzsche's old stomping grounds, and he went where, it's a place where people learn multiple tongues and Latin and Greek, and it's that's where he went to be a scientist first and foremost, and to learn psychology and like to be a doctor. Doctor is what his main thing is like. But now he's a doctor of the mind, and he's like he's wrestling with all these things, and the Red Book he's kind of being very open to these things, and anyway, supposedly a fun thing I'll never do again, and other essays by David Foster Wallace. And again, slowly moving my way through. I think I have Flesh, and I think it's called Both Flesh and Not. Yeah, that's something I've yet to read. One of these other books, I think it was like something to do with paying attention. I think that was actually just a part of The Pale King, though, because I remember the exact same chronology of events going on with that book happening in relation to The Pale King. But anyway, after a supposedly fun thing, obviously that's him going on the cruise ship and being miserable. I'm gonna have to do a review on this. Herzog by Saul Bellow. I did not do a review, but I did do Seize the Day. But yeah, Herzog is somewhat contentious in like literature. He's like one of those people that people cling to as like he's the greats. He's one of the greats. It's like John Updike or like these people who are on bestsellers lists and stuff. He's definitely not unsung. He's not Kafka, and he's not a outsider artist. He's but I listened to some interviews. He has some interesting takes and stuff on writing, and how he said something like Dostoevsky was like wrote in like a kind of flowery almost style of like, but it was like in a way that he wasn't perfect. It wasn't like burned out, but it was like, if you look at it grammatically, it's like in a way it's like if you're very severe about grammar, like you're gonna look at certain things that Dostoevsky says and be like, oh, this is good, but like it's the themes that outlive that kind of in spite of its imperfections. So something I probably said a million times now. Anyway, but yeah, Herzog, he's like interesting thing of like the plight. It has to be satire in some level because it's about a middle-aged man going through a divorce. Interesting that Saul Bellow was coming from a Canadian, but it was like a Canadian slash, because I think he was like, I want to think of it as like almost New Yorkian, Woody Allen kind of person, but he's Canadian. So same way that Lennon Carlin's Canadian, or Joni Mitchell. Like, you get kind of like the aftertaste, I guess, of like Canadianist. Anyway, you can tell how tired I am. But no, I am thrilled. I'm putting on a face. Anyway, so yeah, Herzog, he's like interesting. Dissolution, or marriage is dissolving. And then he has the classic kind of student love affair as a professor, because he's a scholar. Yeah, he's a scholar, I think, of literature. Middle-aged. You get a lot of kind of midlife crises from Bellow. And I like his style. I don't mind it. He talks about him writing letters to all these different philosophers, and he's like, like writing, I think, letters to, I think one of them's to like Montaigne, one of them's to, I think, like Nietzsche, and some of them are fictional characters too, I think, and he's like writing all these letters, and it's like it takes on an epistolary kind of tenor. Anyway, but humiliated and insulted by Fyodor Dostoevsky, one of his lesser known little novels. Yeah, definitely got that Russian, that like there is something wrong with what's going on in the world here. There's something clearly wrong. More impoverished lovers, kind of like in Poor Folk. But anyway, I'm gonna have to definitely review that sometime. I and Thou by Martin Buber. Again, this is a philosophical thing. I heard about Martin Buber. I knew he was a Jewish mystic. And I knew that he was also a philosopher too, like a actual philosopher. He didn't just like play around with that term. Like he was like thinking a lot about being and ontology and the difference. I'm gonna have to look at this again sometime. But yeah, he's talks about I and thou and our responsibility for one another, and how this relationship between I and thou, I think, is like, it's easy for us to get caught up in the I, you know, just through the eyes of the objective, what we think to be objective, to be totally partial to that and nothing else, and just totally be almost solipsistic in that sense, just negate the whole world. But with that, you know, like, we actually are necessarily dependent on one another. We, you know, the way we're born to society, instantly there's a thou that fosters us, that nurtures us into who we are, and that we need that other thou. And so when we saw ourselves up and we're stuck in our like little I mode of being, you know, and like negate everything else, like, we are limiting ourselves, because we're like, sure, maybe we can be an objectivist in the sense of like Ayn Rand, and just be totally selfish, egotistically selfish maybe, but, you know, what good would that actually do anybody in the and not even a utilitarian sense, I don't think. But yeah, that also correlated a lot, or I found that quite similar to Emmanuel Levinas's too. Like, I recently read one of his things, one of those things too that kind of go over my head a lot, but I try to read anyway, and then I try to find different people's perspective on, you know, online, different discourses and opinions, and yeah. Where is it? I know, 100 Years in Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I literally just talked about that. I was like, mentioned that. And yeah, I would like to review it as well. Girl with Curious Hair by David Foster Wallace. But it was one of his, first book of short stories, I think, in late 80s. So yeah, you still have the young, kind of pre-Infinite Jest era. Yeah, I would like to review this too. I've said about all these things, but yeah. These things take time, I say. Anyway, but yeah, the adolescent... I'm sorry. No, wait. The Girl with Curious Hair. Yeah, I liked that, you know, The Girl with Curious Hair, the title story, is, like, very accused of, like, being kind of Bret Easton Ellis, Brat Pack kind of postmodernism, of just being really wry and like, using violence of, like, an ultra kind of heightened, almost, like, cartoonish level of violence, like that in this, you know, the politician, a conservative politician, oddly enough, is like hanging out with all these different people, and, you know, he's like rubbing shoulders with punk people, like anarchic punks, and they're like very violent, and then he goes around, I guess, committing acts of violence, kind of in a almost a Clockwork Orange kind of, you know, Anthony Burgess kind of way, dystopia. It's like a weird kind of weird version of reality, but with these elements of what's going on in the real world too. So, yeah, it's just like, I guess, starting out, cutting your teeth on writing, you're going to have things be called derivative or this or that, or like, you're part of this. But I think for the most part, he was like, you know, not really sure exactly what he was writing per se in that sense, or not to say put words in his mouth, but I think I did like find the one with Lyndon B. Johnson with like the secretary who was like, had like kind of homoerotic feelings for, and like was in love with Lyndon B. Johnson, to be funny and sad at the same time. Kind of reminded me of like a David Lynch kind of one of those tragic comic moments of someone so in over their head, but you feel bad for them, but you can't help laugh at the circumstances, because it's like, why would you be in love with what is remotely appealing about Lyndon B. Johnson, I guess. Anyway, I mean, he did have an air of charisma, I guess, you know. He got things done. He stared at people, I think. You know, he like his famous Johnson, what was it called, the Johnson method, where he like stared down at people until they submitted to whatever he was beckoning them to do. Anyway, but yeah, there's a interesting fellow. The Adolescent by Raw Youth, Fyodor Dostoevsky. I would like to review this, but I'm very iffy, because it's like I feel like I should tackle things more, and it was like this novel, the themes kind of collate. But yeah, you know, it's about a kid a young guy who wants to become a Rothschild from the start, from the get-go, and he's like very ambitious, but there's also like a lot of other things going on. He's like, in the sense, and it's also a bit of a Raskolnikov type of thing. He's not as, I don't think, you know, Alexei, I guess, from the Raw Youth is as more willing to make more exchanges and like kill people for the sake of it. But I think he's definitely ambitious from the start, but then he's mellowed out by, I think, there's this love affair that he has, and he's like falls in love with this girl, and it's like, and it's like classic Dostoevsky kind of this the ambitious kind of male has there's different the women of Dostoevsky's are very have like almost an archetype of like being mellowing the kind of harsher kind of edges out of the protagonist. So I thought that was really interesting. Wow, I'd have to split this into 3 parts. My phone is actually going down. But actually, let's see. Apologies. Okay, let's see. So Short History of Modern Philosophy by Roger Scruton. That was Roger Scruton. I think I read Beauty before that, and like the documentary is also I highly recommend. Yeah, he was a tried and true philosopher. Tit for tat. He not just because he went to Oxford, but he has a good grasp, I think, on not just Western philosophy, but just all with modern philosophy. He even prefaced it, I think, with Plato, Socrates, and even like maybe Parmenides and Heraclides and stuff like that. Like I think he's got a good view of the classics, I think, and I think he's pretty well rounded. I just kind of disagree with him. Mildly disagree with him. His take on postmodernism, though. I think he kind of is appeals a little bit too much to tradition, but I'm gonna have to save that one for later. Okay, so Happy by Darren Brown. Really highly recommend. I like how an illusionist in the entertainment industry who could easily kind of not talk about these topics and these kind of depressing, dreary things about Stoicism and the meaning of life and stuff that you bring up at a party if you kind of want to bring the mood down, I guess. Maybe I'm being too self-deprecating, but he fleshes these concepts out, and he's like, he actually, in a interesting way, even though he's not like a professional, like he didn't go to, I don't think he went to like a university before, but he has a good grasp on psychology and philosophy, and he talks about Jung and Carl Jung and his getting in touch with the shadow, and he talks about Nietzsche and I think Dostoevsky and Kafka and certain things from like pop culture too, like like whether it's like movies of Richard Linklater or David Lynch, and like just certain things of like how to, and like he had a really good understanding of like the way he described like Stoicism being really when you talk about Epictetus, or that he was talking about like how to truly understand like what a person's going through, like you have to understand that like they're completely different circumstances, completely different from your own, and like what they're born into. So like there's no feasible way of understanding that. So you have to kind of take that kind of weird kind of veil of ignorance, I guess, to kind of to know, that there's so much that you don't know, I guess. So, A Christmas Carol, Charles Dickens. Again, something I never read. I'd like to get more into Dickens too, like the Pickwick Papers, but it's like a really big one. I do remember reading, for what it's worth, going through Tale of Two Cities when I was younger. So one of the few books that I remember actually reading in school. There's a lot of book neglection. After that was the Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie. I'm gonna be honest, I wasn't a big fan of this. For some reason, there's not a lot of people online are doing like any discussions on it. It's just weird because you think like it's like magic realism talks about these things. It's mostly the effect, it's the legend that it had on the Muslim world and the world at large, basically, with this idea of anti-censorship. So it's like the themes and the plot of the book got lost, and nobody really cares. And they're like, "Whoa, Salman Rushdie's book, Satanic Versions, is really good. I liked it." It's weird. Like nobody really. I mean, I guess you look up Wikipedia, like probably put like reviews and be like, "Well, it was like a stirring, dizzying thing or whatever." But like I didn't feel that. I felt like it was like kind of a little bit too much like trying to, the whole thing with like and obviously Rushdie had some leverage because, of his background, but this, I didn't really feel for the the Middle Eastern, like the actors or the, on the plane, I think, when the plane crashed, I can't remember exactly what happened. I didn't really feel for the characters. I didn't really see them as real people. They seemed like kind of ideals, like just like kind of like, I spun these up. This is no bad thing about magic realism, because I actually like that genre in general. But it's like because he spun these characters up, and they're just like these wild scenarios that are so out there, and they're like, and then this happened, and then he went to breathe life into this other person, and then that person started walking on the moon or something. It's just like very so out there that it's like, okay, well, why do I invest time? Because like, if I can have the freedom to do that, and this may be what Cormac McCarthy said. I'm not trying to compare myself at all, but he said something like, maybe these were the limitations of magic realism, and I think I'm inclined to agree. But yeah, I didn't really. Again, it might need to be reread, and I'm definitely going to read more Rushdie, but I'm going to probably take a bit of a break. By that, I mean a few years. Anyway, so Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. I really love this one. I got to review this sometime. Yeah, just really wry, really witty, lots of social commentary, lots of mystery and like intrigue, and like, who you gonna root for? Like, is it gonna be Nick and Amy, or is it both Nick and Amy at first, where you like know the facile story of it? And it's just like, I love how Gillian Flynn has such like she doesn't like disappear into into her head necessarily, but she's she's using the story, like, as she's coming back, she's like making it's like a pragmatic point about couples and about love in general, and like there's an existential point. I do get that, but like there is, I do love that in a sense, like writing from the point of view of like both of them, and like their accounts, and like how they differ and contrast. I really like that. Buddenbrooks by Thomas Mann. I think I did this one too. His first novel, I think, did really, really good for a first novel, especially for something of that size and depth. March of the Lowlands, Angel Guimara. Very little known thing. I think I heard obliquely about from like a Sufjan Stevens song where he talked about Manleek, I Feel So Used. I think it's from Karen Lowell. Yeah, probably one of the first ones I ever heard of him. Yeah, there's one where he's like, are we to something or celebrated Manleek, I Feel So Used. Oh, and all of me all to you. This is Manleek, and he's like, somebody. I was looking up who that might have been, and then somebody wrote like a little piece on it. It was like saying that, it mentions this 1901, I think, play called Terabraxas, I think, and that basically Terabraxa was a Catalan way of saying it, because it was originally written in Catalan, which is obviously the geographical in challenge like me. That's actually in a part of Spain too. But yeah, there's Angel Guimara was kind of a little known playwright and a dramatist, and it's actually quite hard to find copies of that kind of stuff too. I had to kind of look quite a bit more than usual for stuff like that, or stuff by like Karl Spitteler too, that little known Swiss poet that Carl Jung mentioned too, as this image of the imago. Like, I was trying to find that poem, or that the Prometheus and Epimetheus, that, and I can't find it with any of it in English, and it's just like a shame, because it's like really good like philosophical works too, like Thomas Nagel's like essays on what it's like to be a bat. It's like, not, again, you're going to that academia thing where it's like somebody has it for as a part of a compilation, but it's in German, so it's like, yeah, okay. Anyway, Story of the Eye by Georges Bataille. Georges Bataille, I think it's Bataille, I've heard. Not huge on it. It was very, I get it's lightheaded really quick. I'm going to do a review of it even still, because I think it warrants it. But yeah, just on account of like the reading quality of it, like me sitting down reading about car accidents, very vivid descriptions of graphic stuff, and even now I'm starting to get kind of lightheaded. I get really lightheaded. I don't know why. I'm queasy. Call me a wuss, call me whatever. I don't know. I just can't really. I don't know. I just don't get certain things like, like the movie, some of Gaspar Noé. Like, I really want a thematic point. Like, I like his stuff, but, like, digging in my heels and watching it and just, like, it takes the time. It took me, like, 3 days to watch, what's the name of it? The one about the DMT trip, but, like I mentioned it in my thing about movies, but anyway, so, but yeah, the, Sword of the Eye was just, like, all out, just completely, the whole thing with, like, the one priest they end up killing, and then they end up using, like, there's, like, the image of, like, the bull's eye, the bull having the eye, the image of, like, the eye being this all-seeing eye, Illuminati eye. I did like that type of aspect, but I think the way in which it was told, and Bate too, like, I'm like, maybe there's something else by Bate I like, and then the other one is him talking about, I can't remember what it's called, something to do with pain, but he's like, I'm like, maybe I'll like this one, and I look it up, and it's, like, him talking about an essay on this photograph that he kept to himself of this Chinese, I think, might be a Korean person, getting death by 1,000 lashes, basically, like, just complete, getting cut deliberately that many times, and the blood loss and the amount of pain. It's, like, the absolute amount of pain, I think, and then that's the stuff that, I don't want to know, but, like, I do know, and I don't know why. It's, like, kind of staring into the abyss again. I have phases where I like to look into that stuff out of curiosity, morbid curiosity, but I will say, but I do get where he's coming from, and I'll read that, but when I'm ready. I don't know. I'm just not sure if I feel like there's spacing for this kind of thing. Like, the Rape of Nanking was one of those things where I'm like, okay, I really want to learn about what happened there. Like, what happened? How did it get so out of hand? And then I did. Like, I learned about the Imperial Beast of Japan by Ira Chang. Had a very tragic end of her life, too. Like, at the age of, like, 30-something, I think. Because, she couldn't take it, like, the images that haunted her, like, ever since she learned about it as a kid, too. I think attributed to how much she wanted to tell other people about it, because it was, like, so, like, the Japanese people were so ashamed and just wanted to pretend like it didn't exist, and, like, I think even today, judging from the semi-recent documentaries I think I saw, so, people are still very tight-lipped about it. Anyway, but, yeah, this, Wild Sheep Chase by Haruki Murakami. I already reviewed this. I already even mentioned it. Gravity's Rainbow, Thomas Pynchon. I did not review this. I did watch there was, like, a really big part series. I can't remember. It's like, this guy had a 20-part series, if you guys want to watch it. Can't remember his name, but he had, I only made my way a couple of ways through, maybe. And then there's this other guy, Leaf by Leaf. I just randomly name dropped him, which I feel kind of, like, bad and maybe good, I don't know, but yeah, he has really good book reviews, but I've only been following him for, like, maybe a couple months now, maybe a month, and yeah, he has a 3 or 4 hour thing on Gravity's Rainbow, and I'm like, I'm not sure if I want quite, I just listened to like almost 3 hour thing on, like, Gnosticism, and I'm not quite sure if I'm ready to get back into that, but yeah, I have it in my watch later, I will see it, it's in my queue. But yeah, Gravity's Rainbow, definitely, there's a lot more layers than I first thought. I thought it was, like, gobbledygook at first, because I was like, what is going on, Is postmodernism, is this really what it's about? And I was like, I learned later on, it was like, oh, he's talking about, the, Chinese, what was it, the 21 thing, the 21, Chinese, like, the year of, I don't know why I'm blanking, the year of the rabbit, the year of this and that, he's basically talking about, the Zodiac. It's like, he takes from the Zodiac, and there's a lot of cultural references, too, of, like, with Slothrop and all these characters, as kind of stand-ins for these things of, and obviously, like, the phallic reference of of Gravity's Rainbow, obviously, it's like being a, is a the rockets in there is a reference to that, obviously. So the Freud comes up a lot too. Anyway, but yeah, the Timaeus and the Critias by Plato. aside from the Republic, I think this is the only other stuff I read by him. And there is quite a bit, actually, that I found out over the years of how much Plato was like actually able to write down, surprisingly, and probably how much of it was lost to time too. Like, nothing that we hear about Socrates actually exists. Like, everything we know about Socrates is through the lens of Plato. So yeah, so obviously it's more of another thing of in the tradition of the Socratic kind of dialogue of, you know, Socrates talking to people, like, be it not Lysander, but you know, the guests at the dinner party, like in the oh yeah, there was a symposium where I read that, yeah. But yeah, a lot of them have that kind of the same iteration of Socrates talking to people and then owning them with logic and facts. Not really, but, you know, talks about, you know, the migration of souls and madam psychosis, and how, hinting at the end, there's like a lot of really interesting stuff about, you know, even like the sheep that they saw around them may have contained souls of the dead, you know, previous lifetime. I thought that was interesting. War and Peace, Volume 1. I'm definitely going to do a review on this. I've yet to read Volume 2, because it's another big book. I'm not quite ready to strap down and read that yet. Status Anxiety by Alain de Botton. Really good take, I think. A little bit coming from a little bit of a, I don't want to call him snobby, but Alain de Botton has a little bit, it's not just in the name, obviously. You know, he's English, but he was born in Switzerland. I follow and still semi-follow the School of Life, and I do attribute them to, like, me getting kind of into certain things, like, you know, like thinkers, like, be it, you know, Heidegger, or writers of, like, Flaubert, and, like, me seeing them in a different way rather than just through, like, they put in perspective, like, this is what did. And I really like their video on Kafka too, and, like, just like the stop motion type of things, and the way it's put together is, like, you know, it's like, it's just, I just like the way it's, like, it flows, and, like, you know, like the measured pace of you know, how they're narrated, and you could call them pretentious, and there is definitely, I definitely see that, and I definitely don't agree with them on things, and I think they make certain weird pseudo-scientific claims about certain things, and, like, really big kind of grandiose things about child rearing and stuff, like, you should never have children, and, you know, but that's just, like, you know, I think, like, after getting out of a hole and reading Schopenhauer too much, you kind of get that kind of weird way of, like, looking at things, like, you're, like, you turn very pessimistic, I guess, but yeah, but, you know, I'm slowly working my way through stuff. I think I read, the Essays in Love. I think his first book was pretty interesting. It had a lot of, like, philosophical references and artistic references and stuff. More Pricks Than Kicks by Samuel Beckett was his first novel. Very Joycean, if I remember. It was a series of short stories, I think. And what I recall is that it was, like, a lot of, like, Irish lingo, just, like, a lot of go along to get, you know, get me this thing from, you know, the something shop, and going, we don't to do something or other to get me some Leo. I can't even speak right now. Jeez. But, you know, like, he's, like, going to get himself a nice cut of meat, and, like, you know, just, like, yeah, you can see the reminiscence of, like, that, and James Joyce characters too, because they're both Irish too. They both went to the same university, same Dublin, Trinity College. So I think so. Anyway, but yeah, Madame Bovary, Gustave Flaubert. I would like to review this, but yeah, I really like how it shows, just like in, you know, with Lady Chatterley's Lover, like, it shows it, you know, a sympathetic view of, like, the home life and, like, the longing, and, you know, the fact that, you know, her husband, you know, wasn't as, you know, cut out as he maybe wasn't all that was cut out to be. He was, like, you know, he went for her because she saw him as something safe, I guess, and then she ends up kind of, you know, holding all this stuff in, and, you know, comes out, and then she has an affair, and then it's like she has these romantic ideals that are very unrealistic, I might say. So I really liked that. You know, it didn't really say, like, she's so stupid for cheating. It's like, you know, she had, you know, from her point of view, it's like, you know, there's things that you can't really control, like, I guess, you know, you can't really blame her, but you can definitely see that she made mistakes too. Anyway, but yeah, The Notebooks of Malta, The Reds Breaks by Rainer Maria Rilke. Yeah, I would definitely like to read more of his stuff. Definitely up there in my top poets and just writers in general. What is Art by Leo Tolstoy? Obviously, it's like an essay. It's like, I can't remember who recommended this, but yeah, it's like a lot of different takes on like interesting things he had about like Pushkin too. Like he was saying like he was almost confused at first, like to learn when he was younger that Pushkin was like a drunkard and he died in a duel, like, you know, and that he was celebrated by this great artist too. Like he was trying to point out what was art, and then he actually kind of went the route of it has to have something. It has to have some Christ faced. It has to have some, you know, beautification or like some sacred, some element of the sacred in it. I think to be true art, I think, is that it has to have some Platonic. He was, I think, referring to some Platonic ideal of like, you know, we have to have something like that. And even Pushkin, like you read The Prophet, I think like he got pretty dark spiritual like with that, you know, like, you know, with that kind of vision of like, you know, like a godly kind of seer like vision. So even like, you know, and I'm not like quite sure exactly what to make of all that, but yeah, the Communist Manifesto I read by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, just because I had it on my bookshelf. I wanted to give it a go, and yeah, it's just like pretty quick read. Anyway, I don't know if I can get into that right now, but Letters to a Young Poet by Rainer Maria Rilke. Him, really interesting, really great, a way of manner of like comforting a young poet, but also giving them like really, really like sincere, almost austere advice at times, like just being like, if you don't, oddly enough, like Lady Gaga even said something about this book. She was saying that like one of her favorite lines was like Rilke saying to the young poet that if you don't love art, you know, if you're not ready to do poetry, if you're not ready to commit to it, like you're not ready to, if you something, if like the stakes are so high, like if you were ready to sacrifice yourself by drowning before giving up poetry, like if you still didn't give up poetry, like it might not be for you. It's like it's not for you, but like he set these very high stakes. But yeah, Landlady by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Again, me just going through his shorter works. I think that was like a novel or novella, I think. On Liberty by John Stuart Mill. Again, I think, you know, he was a utilitarianism, so I was like kind of like predisposed to be a little bit skeptical of his stuff, just because I was long held had a kind of grudge against utilitarians, poor utilitarians. Jeremy Bentham just wanted to make it best for people, even though if it meant him having his head on a freaking platter in the University of, is it Oxford, or is it, I can't remember, his head and his rotten head, which went totally wayward, and then him putting his corpse on display for the good of science, because he was so utilitarian. But anyway, but yeah, he sort of had some interesting, pretty good insights about liberty and, like, you know, how to attain it and make it equable to everybody. And I think his version of utilitarianism was more digestible in my sense than I think Jeremy Bentham was almost a little bit, like, literally autistic. I think actually Scruton might have said that. He said that he might have had traits of autism, like just like the panopticon is not a viable way to survey people, Mr. Bentham. It's just creepy. Anyway, but yeah, Uncle's Dream, Fyodor Dostoevsky, one of his short stuff. Mysterious Stranger, Mark Twain, really eerie. I just remember watching the cartoon years back of the Will Vinton, because I actually grew up watching Will Vinton's Martin the Cobbler. And I still remember the exact same like pseudo-Russian voice that the voice actor would do, like, Martin, like, it's Vladimir, my friend Vladimir, we're going to... I just remember growing up with that and being like weirded out, but also comforted in a weird way, because it's like it was like given to us on this VHS, and like it was the VHS tune. My brother joked that like it was as if the tune and the sound on it, like the music played, the soundtrack was like both detuned in real life and also the VHS quality stuff is also like skewered and on tune, and then also everything else is also atonal and din throughout our TV set too. So it was like threefold. But yeah, but it was like heartwarming too. I think it's like grotesque, but also heartwarming. I don't know how. I just have a soft spot for Martin the Cobbler, the Will Vinton one, and the story in general by Tolstoy. Tolstoy's just a great storyteller in general. Walk in the Light While There Is Light by Tolstoy. Yeah, he has a lot of really good stories in there. And that's where the Shawshank Redemption comes from, I think, right? It was like loosely based off of Tolstoy, I think. Obviously, Stephen King took some creative liberties, but yeah. Uncle is True, Mysterious. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream by Harlan Ellison. Interesting character, yeah. It's like, don't pay the writer. Why would you pay the writer? Pay the effing writer. It's like, yeah, I do. It's like, yeah. Anyway, he's, very combative, but, you almost kind of see why in some sense in the way that he was raised, but anyway, but yeah, it's like really interesting sci-fi kind of thing going on. A little bit of that speculative fiction kind of what if, with the whole, like, these tortured people are tortured over and over again by this robotic kind of entity thing going out. This, device keeps carrying out tortures against these people, and they're just like, yeah, I lost the thread of the storyline, but yeah, it was like, I just remember hearing that I have no mouth and I must scream phrase, and I was like, ooh, it's pretty darn good. And I think, like, Harlan Ellison talks about, like, in the forward to that, he talks about how he came up with that. Like, a friend, I think, partially gave him the idea. The Ego on Its Own, Max Stirner. Obviously, Max Stirner, again, a philosophy work. His stuff is kind of hard to parse. He was part of, like, what, the Left Hegelians or something? Interesting guy. Don't agree with him all, with necessarily. I mean, like, you have to, it's like called irrational egotism, I think. Like, spooks, like everything, like we think about justice, society, or social norms, customs, religion, they're all spooks in the word. That's where I heard about, I think other philosophers mention him. I was like, just trying to get a quick thing. Anyway, Master and Nimbus Emissary, Ian McGilchrist, I think I mentioned him. I don't feel like I'm ready to do a thing on that, because it's like very, he's coming from it from a not psychologist, but psychiatrist, I think. But he's also a I think he's kind of multiple fields, kind of a polymath, I guess. He draws from philosophy, and he draws from, like, as far as back as, like, ancient Greece, like, he talks about, he mentions a lot Julian Jaynes' The Origins of Consciousness, which I do have on my bookshelf, which I have not read yet, but yeah, he mentions that he refers that back, like how talks about, like, consciousness and, like, a left brain, right brain, and the divisions in the corpus callosectomy, and yeah, I found that stuff, like, interesting, but I take it in small doses. So, Concept of Time by Martin Heidegger. I was just trying to find something smaller, just basically something I could more easily digestible that wasn't being in time. So I was like reading that. I was trying to get a better, and yeah, he's once you get past the writing and then how obscure and not opaque, but how arcane it gets. He has some pretty good stuff to say. Interesting. So where was I? Islam and the Future of Tolerance by Majid Nawaz and Sam Harris. I was just trying to go through their stuff to Sam Harris's stuff, just to give them, what has this guy has to say about whatever. They have pretty. They set forth, like, what is our future of, like, if everything we say is, this is the same thing with Salman Rushdie. If you get to this point where you're, like, even literally just, like, to the point where writing a cartoon about Muhammad is, like, is that going to be the death knell for me? Is it going to be, like it was for the Charlie Hebdo shootings, and very well known. Like, what is the world like? How are we going to deal with this context of this ever changing kind of? And they said, like, the Muslim world growing and stuff, and they've been accused of being like, it's like, hey, watch out for them, but calling for the genocide of Muslims, and I'm like, I'm not really seeing that though. So, but I am trying to hear different sides to it. I think for the last few years at least, I've been of the same mind of just being like a little bit wary, just being like, okay, well, I don't don't have any reason to be explicitly anti, religion on certain things or this topic, I'm not really gonna get in the weeds on that. I mean, I'm not here to be polarizing, but at the same time, I also kind of want to be a little bit polarizing, but I'm not sure how much. So I'm trying to figure that out. So we'll see. In the future, I might change. I might be more like, I don't care what anybody thinks. I'm gonna say what I want, and screw the opposition, screw the naysayers. So that might be what I might do. So, you can see I'm just slowly losing my. Well, I lost my train of thought a while ago, but I'm. In the Ask Saw the Age by Nick Cave, I heard Better Than Food book reviews recommend this, and I was like, hey, Nick Cave likes Flannery O'Connor / William Faulkner is taking a lot of Southern Gothic kind of vibes, so yeah, I'm in for it. Definitely had a nice, interesting style talking in Southern, especially from this Australian singer-songwriter, musician. I wish I listened to more Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. I do really like. I did grow up, my teenage years where I did hear, some of their stuff of like, the Mercy Seas, probably one of my favorite songs. The Mercy Seas rising, if my head is burning, I feel I'm yearning to be done with all this and questioning of truth, the die for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and anything I wasn't. At least I told an eye. Johnny Cash did a version of that too, and I've come to be more. I initially favored his version, and I was like, as I learned, I didn't quite get the kind of like the almost like soft, like the spoken version of him, Nick Cave, kind of like muttering at first and coming in there with sing-songing and talking at the same time. But I grew to love that one nowadays, at least. But Johnny Cash did, kind of introduce me to certain artists, like, certain, kind of lesser known people too, like Will Oldham or Bonnie Prince Johnny, or stuff or things I didn't really know were covers, like, old little standards and stuff, folk standards and stuff by, U2 as well, and, like he had a, pretty, he wasn't a massive talent, I don't think, and I'm not like a massive fan, like, he didn't, he wasn't like a virtuoso, but he, I think he was a interesting personality. Anyway, Tartuffe by Moliere. It's a play. I just figured I'd get through it because it was like in our library for a while, so I was like, picked it up. Interesting little play. Comedy, I think. Tartuffe, I think, is like almost like a comedy of like manners, or a comedy of errors, maybe. It's like, I think he's like kind of like inept, I guess, in a lot of ways, and like a lot of people have interesting gossiping things to say. A lot of funny stuff happening on him. What is this, 1700s, early 1600s, or France? Yeah, interesting. Just like Jean Racine. I've yet to read his stuff too. Sanctuary by William Faulkner. Another thing we had in our library, yeah, there's a lot of Faulkner books in there. But yeah, Sanctuary, yeah, it's like what it was, more the seedy underbelly of like what was going on in 1920s. I think in New Orleans, I think it's set. But yeah, it's like, Sanctuary is obviously kind of like tongue in cheek almost, or it's like, the stuff he's talking about is like kind of the antithesis to a sanctuary. It's like, in some sense, a sanctuary could be a safe haven. It could be in any generic sense. Like, it doesn't have to just be explicitly religious. But yeah, Othello by William Shakespeare. Yeah, I don't think I ever fully read. I just remember reading Hamlet some time back. It's various dramatized versions, and yeah. But yeah, I'm slowly working my way through Shakespeare. I think I did A Midsummer Night's Dream as well, semi-recently, so yeah, just trying to reawaken myself a little bit more, because I keep hearing, references, stuff like that to Shakespeare. So. Epigrams by Oscar Wilde. Another quick read, too. Just a list of, like, different things. You could tell I was, like, grasping at straws at the last thing, because I was reading a good deal of little short books at the end of the thing. But then there's Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. I did a review on this, yeah. Theogony, the poem by Hesiod. Again, I can't really remember exactly what happened in Theogony. I do remember, oh yeah, we did have he talked about like the kind of like another kind of reassessment of Greek gods and goddesses and the muses and you know, like Eupicury or all the different things. I'm totally blanking on the names. Or the Euterpia and you know, these kind of like reassessing and like how rethinking them in a new way, because I think Hesiod was a little bit, was he Roman? I'm not sure. Anyway, so the Epic of Gilgamesh, I always like to make a different thing for this, to talk about this, because it did really, you know, this idea of like, just like with anything, like any old literature you find, it's just like literally one of the oldest stories ever told, and it's just like, dang, you start to really, just like, even if you can't quite resonate, this is like the human quality of the fact that somebody was alive writing this on a, you know, inscribing it on a tablet, took the time, and was preserved, and it persevered through the years. You know, just that fact is just fascinating on its own terms, and I think, like, you know, Gilgamesh's story is very human-like. He's like, even though he's like, what, a god coming down from the heavens and kind of coming down and going through a rite of passage to be with a woman, to be accepted into the kind of world, just like I think the Enuma Elish, I think, too, is like a another thing. Anyway, so yeah, those were the 100 books I read. Oh, I'm sorry, Kierkegaard the Cripple was the last one. I'm sorry, I almost forgot that one. Kierkegaard the Cripple too. So something I found in my library. Pretty old book. Kind of little known author named Theodore Hacker, who had an interesting take. I think that Kierkegaard might have actually been crippled. You know, he might have actually had a hunchback, a bit of, you know. And I found it fascinating because it could have, he said that could have actually inspired his philosophy in a way, and like the way he viewed the world, because he had to deal with kind of not only just the way that people in Denmark cartoonized him and made him out to be kind of a ridiculous figure, not to be taken seriously, but just to also give him this image of like maybe somebody not really approachable in a sense. I guess that kind of affected the way he thought, maybe. Interesting theory, but that is all I have for today. I'm running out of steam, as you could probably tell, for the last hour at least. I did not know I'd be doing this long. If you made it this far, thank you. And yeah, I'll see you all in the next one. Hopefully sooner than later. So, thanks for watching.